The Napoleonic Wars were among the most defining conflicts in history. They shaped the future of Europe, redrew national borders, and saw the rise and fall of one of the most legendary military figures of all time, Napoleon Bonaparte. This is the story of how a young Corsican officer rose to become the ruler of France and reshape the course of world history. It begins long before the battlefield victories, long before the grand armies, and long before the empire. It begins with the boy who would become Napoleon. 1769, birth on the island of Corsica. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica. His birth came just 1 year after France had annexed Corsica from the Republic of Genoa. The island's people, including Napoleon's family, were still deeply divided between loyalty to France and a desire for Corsican independence. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, had once supported Corsican independence, but later allied himself with the French. This decision would ensure the family's future in France's political and military system. The Bonaparte family was minor nobility but not wealthy. They relied on connections and patronage to provide opportunities for their children. Napoleon's mother, Letizia, was known for her strict discipline and strong character, traits she would pass down to her son. Early education and military training, 1779–1785. At just 9 years old, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to receive a formal education. He attended the Royal Military School of Brienne, where he quickly distinguished himself in mathematics, history, and military strategy. But Napoleon was an outsider. His Corsican accent made him stand out among his French classmates. He was often mocked for his foreign roots and small stature. He withdrew into books, strategy, and his own ambition. At 16, he graduated from the École Militaire in Paris, specializing in artillery, an important branch of the French military. He was now a commissioned officer in the French army. The French Revolution begins, 1789. Just 4 years later, in 1789, a revolution erupted in France. The French monarchy collapsed, and the country was thrown into political and social chaos. For young officers like Napoleon, it was a time of great danger and opportunity. The old order was gone. Ranks were no longer determined by nobility but by talent and loyalty to the revolution. The army was being reshaped as revolutionary France faced war on all sides. For Napoleon, this was a turning point. His ambition would find its first real test on the battlefield. The Siege of Toulon, 1793, Napoleon's first major victory. In 1793, the southern port city of Toulon fell into the hands of royalists who opposed the revolution. They invited British forces to occupy the city. Toulon was strategically vital. If the British held it, they could crush the French Republic from the south. A young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, just 24 years old, was assigned to the siege. He analyzed the city's defenses. He developed a strategy to bombard the British fleet. He used his artillery skills to devastate the enemy's fortifications. On December 19, 1793, Napoleon's strategy forced the British fleet to retreat and the city fell. The French leadership took notice. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. His name began to spread in military circles. This was the first real step toward his rise to power. But France was still in chaos. The Reign of Terror had begun. 1794, the fall of Robespierre and Napoleon's arrest. By 1794, the French Revolution had descended into violence. Thousands were executed in the Reign of Terror, led by Maximilien Robespierre. Political enemies were eliminated. Napoleon was initially aligned with the radical Jacobins, who supported Robespierre. But when Robespierre was overthrown and executed, Napoleon was briefly arrested under suspicion of being too close to the fallen leader. He was stripped of his command. His future seemed uncertain, but fortune was still on his side. 1795, the 13 Vendémiaire, the moment that made Napoleon famous. In October 1795, a royalist rebellion erupted in Paris. Thousands of armed insurgents marched against the government. The French leadership desperately needed someone to defend them. Napoleon was given the command of the city's defenses. He placed artillery along key streets. He ordered his men to fire on the insurgents at close range. In a single decisive attack, he crushed the rebellion. The rebellion was over in hours. Napoleon had saved the French government. For this he was promoted to General of the Army of the Interior, and soon given command of the Army of Italy. This was his next great opportunity, and he would take it. 1796, the Italian campaign begins. By 1796, France was still at war with Austria and its ally. Napoleon was given command of a struggling army in Italy. The troops were exhausted, poorly supplied and demoralized. But Napoleon inspired them. He promised victory. He reorganized the army. He moved quickly and decisively against the Austrian force. What followed was a campaign that would shock Europe. Napoleon, just 27 years old, would begin a series of victories that would make him a legend. The rise of a conqueror. From an unknown Corsican officer to the savior of France, Napoleon had already defied expectation. He had proven his brilliance at Toulon. He had saved the government in Paris. He was about to launch a campaign that would reshape Europe. But this was only the beginning. The Italian campaign would bring his first great military triumph, and the world was about to witness the full power of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Italian campaign, Napoleon's first major conquests, 1796. In March 1796, a 27-year-old general took command of the French army of Italy. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and few expected him to succeed. His army was poorly supplied and low on morale. His men were outnumbered by Austrian and Piedmontese forces. He had never commanded an army in the field before, but within 2 years Napoleon would crush his enemies, transform the battlefield, and make Europe take note. This was his first true campaign, and it would be a masterpiece of warfare. The state of the war in 1796. By 1796, the French Republic was still at war with Austria, Britain and their allies. France was fighting on multiple fronts. In the Netherlands, French forces had secured victory. In Germany, France struggled to push back Austrian forces. In Italy, Austria controlled Lombardy and northern Italy, posing a serious threat to France. The Italian front was seen as less important, but Napoleon saw it differently. He believed that by striking Italy hard and fast, he could force Austria to the negotiating table and shift the balance of the war. His superiors in Paris were skeptical. They gave him a weak and exhausted army. They expected little from him, but Napoleon had a plan. Napoleon's strategy: divide and conquer. Napoleon arrived in Nice in March 1796, and immediately took charge. He reorganized his forces. He gave passionate speeches to inspire his men. He promised them glory, victory and wealth. Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory and riches. Napoleon's plan was bold and simple: break the Austrian and Piedmontese armies apart, force Piedmont to surrender quickly, then turn his full strength against the Austrians. Unlike the traditional slow-moving armies of the time, Napoleon used speed, deception, and surprise attacks, and it worked brilliant. April 1796, the Montenotte campaign, Napoleon's first victories. In April 1796, Napoleon launched his first offensive. He moved swiftly through the mountains of northern Italy. He divided his forces into smaller groups to move fast. He attacked the Austrians and Piedmontese separately, forcing them apart. His first major battle was at Montenotte, on April 12, 1796. The Austrian general Beaulieu was caught by surprise. Napoleon struck hard and forced the Austrians to retreat. Victory at Montenotte was Napoleon's first true battlefield success. His army gained confidence. France now had the momentum in Italy. In the next 2 weeks, Napoleon followed up with a series of rapid victories. Millesimo, April 13, Dego, April 14–15, Mondovi, April 21. By the end of April, Piedmont was defeated and forced to surrender. In just 2 weeks, Napoleon had removed an entire enemy from the war. This was not how wars were usually fought in the 18th century. Most generals moved slowly, waited for reinforcements, and avoided risky maneuvers. Napoleon was different. His speed, audacity, and decisiveness stunned his enemies, and his legend was just beginning. May–June 1796, the French push into Austria's territory. With Piedmont defeated, Napoleon now turned his attention to Austria's forces in Lombardy. He pushed forward aggressively, capturing town after town. Lodi, May 10, 1796. Milan, May 15, 1796. Peschiera, June 1796. But it was the Battle of Lodi that would leave a lasting mark on Napoleon. The Battle of Lodi, May 10, 1796. At Lodi, Napoleon faced a major obstacle, a heavily defended bridge over the Adda River. Thousands of Austrian soldiers and cannons guarded the crossing. Most generals would have waited for reinforcements, or found another way around. Napoleon chose to attack head-on. He personally led his troops in a bold assault across the bridge. Under a hail of Austrian gunfire, the French charged. After brutal fighting, the bridge was taken and the Austrians retreated. Victory at Lodi gave Napoleon immense confidence. It was here that he began to believe in his own destiny. Years later, he would say, "At Lodi, I first saw myself as a man of destiny. I saw the road that would lead me to greatness." With Lodi captured, Napoleon marched into Milan, the heart of northern Italy. By June 1796, the French had taken control of most of northern Italy. The Siege of Mantua, July 1796, February 1797. The Austrian counterattack, but Austria was not defeated yet. The Austrians sent multiple armies to relieve Mantua, a fortress city crucial to their hold on Italy. Between July 1796 and February 1797, Napoleon fought 4 major battles to defend his gains: Castiglione, August 5, 1796, Bassano, September 8, 1796, Arcole, November 15 to 1796, Rivoli, January 14, 1797. At Arcole, Napoleon once again led from the front. Carrying a flag, he personally tried to rally his troops across a bridge under enemy fire. His men hesitated until Napoleon himself charged forward. He was almost killed, but his bravery inspired the army to victory. At Rivoli, Napoleon crushed the final Austrian attempt to break the siege. With the Austrian reinforcements defeated, Mantua surrendered on February 2. March 1797, Napoleon's army marches on Vienna. With Italy secured, Napoleon marched toward Austria itself. His lightning-fast advance shocked the Austrian leadership. He threatened Vienna, forcing Austria to negotiate for peace. On April 18, 1797, the Treaty of Leoben was signed. Austria ceded much of northern Italy to France. The war in Italy was over. Napoleon had defeated one of Europe's strongest powers in just 1 year. And now, all of Europe knew his name. A new war begins. By 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte had secured his legend in Italy. He had defeated the Austrians in a series of brilliant battles. He had forced Austria to make peace. He had cemented his place as France's most celebrated general. But in Paris, Napoleon sensed danger. His rising fame made him a threat to the ruling government. The Directory, political enemies wanted to sideline him. He needed a new campaign to maintain his power. He turned his eyes to Egypt. This was to be his boldest gamble yet, a campaign unlike any before, and a battle against Britain for control of the Mediterranean. The grand ambition. Why Egypt? Napoleon's Egyptian campaign was not just about military conquest. He had 3 key goals. Cut Britain off from India. Britain's wealth and power came from its trade routes, especially with India. If Napoleon could seize Egypt, he could disrupt British trade and weaken its empire. 2. Establish a French colony in the Middle East. France had few overseas colonies compared to Britain. A French-controlled Egypt could be a base for future expansion into the Middle East. 3. Create a legacy beyond war. Napoleon saw Egypt as a land of ancient wonders. He dreamed of following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. He brought 16,700 scholars, scientists, and artists to study and document Egypt's history and culture. This was more than a military expedition. It was a political, economic, and scientific endeavor. But Britain was watching, and they would not let Napoleon take Egypt without a fight. May 1798. The fleet set sail. In May 1798, Napoleon assembled an enormous fleet in secret. 400 ships, 38,000 soldiers, 16,700 scholars and scientists. His plan: sail to Egypt undetected before the British Navy. Under Admiral Horatio Nelson could stop him. Napoleon's first target was Malta, controlled by the Knights of St. John, a Christian military order allied with Britain. June 9, 1798. The capture of Malta. Napoleon landed his troops and quickly besieged the capital, Valletta. The Knights surrendered in less than a day. Malta's powerful naval base now belonged to France. Napoleon spent only 6 days in Malta before setting sail for Egypt. But Nelson was hunting him, and the race to Egypt had begun. July 1, 1798. The French land in Egypt. On July 1, 1798, Napoleon's fleet arrived off the coast of Alexandria, Egypt. His men stormed the city and took it by force. The Egyptian defenders were no match for the well-trained French army. Napoleon declared himself the liberator of Egypt, claiming he had come to free the people from oppression. But the true test was yet to come. Marching south towards Cairo, Napoleon encountered the Mamluks, the ruling warrior elite of Egypt. They were elite horsemen, feared across the Middle East, and they were waiting for him at the banks of the Nile. July 21, 1798. The Battle of the Pyramids. As Napoleon approached Cairo, he found 25,000 Mamluk cavalry blocking his path. They were fierce warriors, famous for their speed and deadly swordsmanship. But Napoleon had a plan. He arranged his men into massive square formations, a tactic he had perfected in Italy. Each square had infantry on the outside, forming an impenetrable wall of bayonet cannons and cavalry inside the square, ready to counterattack. As the Mamluks charged, they were met with devastating musket fire. Wave after wave was cut down. By the end of the battle, 6,000 Mamluks lay dead. The French had lost only. Napoleon rode across the battlefield and declared, "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." It was one of his greatest victories. With Cairo now open, Napoleon marched into the city as a conqueror. But his greatest challenge was yet to come. August 1, 1798. Disaster at the Battle of the Nile. While Napoleon celebrated in Cairo, disaster struck at sea. Admiral Horatio Nelson had found the French fleet at anchor in Abukir Bay. On the night of August 1, the British launched a devastating attack. The French ships were caught unprepared. Nelson maneuvered between the French ships and the shore, trapping them. One by one the French ships were destroyed. The French flagship L'Orient exploded in a massive fireball, killing over 1,000 men instantly. By the end of the night, the French navy was annihilated. Napoleon's army was stranded in Egypt. Britain had won one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Napoleon was now trapped. With no way to return to France, he was forced to fight on in Egypt. Napoleon's Syrian campaign. Determined to expand his conquest, Napoleon marched into Syria in early 7. His goal, capture the key cities of the Levant, and push towards the Ottoman Empire. But this campaign would end in failure. The Siege of Acre, March-May 1799. Napoleon besieged Acre, a fortified coastal city in modern-day Israel. The British and Ottomans defended it fiercely. After 2 months, Napoleon was forced to retreat, one of his few defeats. With his army weakened by disease and lack of supplies, Napoleon returned to Egypt. His dream of conquering the Middle East was over. August 1799. Napoleon abandons Egypt. Back in Egypt, Napoleon learned that France was in crisis. A new war had broken out in Europe. France was losing battles against Austria and Russia. The Directory was weak, and France needed strong leadership. Seizing his chance, Napoleon secretly left Egypt in August 17. Leaving his army behind, he sailed back to France, determined to seize power. By November 1799, he would do just that. The Egyptian campaign was over, but Napoleon's rise to absolute power was just beginning. The road to power. By August 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte was returning to France from his failed Egyptian campaign. He had won great victories in Egypt, but had been trapped after the destruction of the French fleet. Now France was in crisis, losing battles against Austria, Russia, and Britain. The Directory, France's weak government, was on the verge of collapse, but Napoleon saw opportunity. He was still France's most popular general. The people were losing faith in the Directory. He had the ambition and charisma to seize control. In just a few months, Napoleon would overthrow the government and make himself the undisputed leader of France. This is the story of how he seized power. October 1799. Napoleon returns to France. After secretly leaving his army behind in Egypt, Napoleon landed in France on October 9. His arrival was met with excitement. The people adored him. He was seen as France's only hope. The government was deeply unpopular, and people welcomed a strong leader. Even his military failures in Egypt were forgiven. His victories in Italy still outshined his defeats. But Napoleon knew he had to move fast. The Directory was falling apart, and he had to strike before they could react. Within a month, he would launch a coup that would change history. The coup of 18 Brumaire. The Directory was weak, corrupt, and had lost control of France. The economy was collapsing. The military was losing battles. The people were disillusioned with the revolution. A group of politicians, including Emmanuel CS, planned to overthrow the Directory, but they needed a strong general to lead the coup. Napoleon was the perfect choice. The plan. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon's troops surrounded the government buildings in Paris. He entered the Council of 500, the lower house of the French government. His presence alone was enough to intimidate many politicians, but others resisted. At one point the assembly turned against him, shouting, "Down with the dictator." Napoleon stumbled, almost fainting for a moment. It seemed like the coup would fail, but his brother Napoleon Bonaparte saved the day. He called in the army, claiming the politicians were trying to kill Napoleon. Soldiers stormed the chamber, forcing the assembly to dissolve itself. Within hours, Napoleon was in control. The Directory was gone, and in its place, a new government was formed, with Napoleon as first consul, the most powerful man in France. The coup of 18 Brumaire was one of the most successful in history. In a single day, Napoleon had ended the French Revolution and begun his reign. 1800, the Consulate, Napoleon's new government. With the Directory gone, France was now ruled by 3 consuls. But in reality, Napoleon was the true leader. He wasted no time consolidating power. He controlled the army, he controlled the laws, he controlled the government. His first priority, restoring order to France. 1. Economic reforms. He stabilized the currency and created the Bank of France. He ended food shortages and improved trade. He reduced government corruption. 2. Legal reforms. The Napoleonic Code. One of Napoleon's greatest achievements was the Napoleonic Code, 1804. It simplified France's legal system, making laws clear and fair. It guaranteed equality before the law for men at least. It protected property rights, benefiting the middle class. The Napoleonic Code would influence legal systems around the world, even centuries later. 3. Political control. Eliminating opposition. Napoleon made sure no one could challenge him. He censored the press, controlling what people read. He spied on political opponents. He held public votes, plebiscites, but always made sure the results were in his favor. By 1802, Napoleon had secured his rule, but one final obstacle remained. France was still at war with Britain and Austria. Napoleon had to win one more great battle to cement his power. 1800, the Battle of Marengo, securing France. By 1800, France was once again at war with Austria and Britain. Napoleon needed a decisive victory to prove himself as France's rightful ruler. The Italian campaign. Napoleon led an army across the Alps, launching a surprise attack into Italy. His goal, retake northern Italy from the Austrians. June 14, 1800, the Battle of Marengo. Napoleon's army was caught off guard by the Austrians. At first, the French were losing badly, but Napoleon refused to retreat. At the last moment, his reinforcements arrived. The French counterattacked. The Austrians were driven back. By nightfall, the French had won a stunning victory. The Battle of Marengo secured Napoleon's control of France. Austria was forced to make peace. Napoleon's popularity skyrocketed. He was now untouchable. Napoleon becomes first consul for life. With France now at peace, Napoleon moved to strengthen his rule. In 1802, he held a public vote, plebiscite. Should Napoleon be first consul for life? The result? Yes, 99% of the vote. Though in reality, Napoleon manipulated the results. Now Napoleon's rule was permanent. He could make laws without opposition. He controlled the army, the courts, and the government. He had more power than any French ruler before him. But Napoleon was not finished.
He wanted even more power. 1804. The coronation. Napoleon becomes emperor. In 1804, Napoleon made a bold announcement. He would declare himself Emperor of France. It was the final step in his rise to absolute power. December 2, 1804. The coronation. The ceremony was held in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The Pope himself was present, ready to place the crown on Napoleon's head. But in a dramatic moment, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands. He placed it on his own head, sending a clear message: I am emperor because of my own power, not because of the church. Napoleon was now emperor of France, and Europe would never be the same.
A new war begins. By 1805, Napoleon was at the height of his power. He was emperor of France, ruling with absolute authority. He had reformed the French government, bringing stability after years of revolution. He had defeated Austria, forcing them to make peace in 18. But across Europe, his enemies were regrouping. Britain, the only country still at war with France, was building new alliances. Austria and Russia, fearing Napoleon's growing power, prepared for war once again. Prussia remained neutral, for now, but watched closely. By August 1805, a new alliance, the Third Coalition, was formed. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden joined forces against Napoleon. Their goal, to destroy the French Empire before it could dominate Europe. But Napoleon was ready. He was about to launch one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Napoleon's grand plan, invading Britain. Before the Third Coalition had fully formed, Napoleon had another plan in mind. His main enemy was Britain, and he wanted to invade England itself. He gathered a huge army, over 80,000 men, at Boulogne, on the northern coast of France. He planned to cross the English Channel and capture London. If successful, Britain would be forced to surrender. But there was one big problem: the British Royal Navy. Britain had the strongest navy in the world. Napoleon could only cross the Channel if the French fleet could distract or defeat the British Navy. The role of the French and Spanish fleets. Napoleon ordered the French and Spanish fleets to sail to the Caribbean, drawing the Royal Navy away. Then they would rush back to Europe, unite their forces, and escort Napoleon's army across the Channel. But the plan failed. The British intercepted the French fleet before it could return. Napoleon's chance to invade Britain was lost. He had spent 2 years preparing for an invasion that would never happen. Instead, he turned his attention to the growing threat on the continent. The Third Coalition was now at war with France, and Napoleon was ready to strike first. August 1805, the Ulm Campaign. With Britain, Austria, and Russia preparing to invade France, Napoleon moved first. His Grand Armée, the finest army in Europe, abandoned the invasion of Britain. Instead, they marched east, heading toward Germany and Austria. His strategy was simple but brilliant. He would surprise the Austrian army before the Russians could arrive to help them. He would use speed and deception to trap the Austrian forces before they could escape. The Austrian mistake. The Austrian commander, General Mack, believed Napoleon was still in France. He took his army to Ulm, a fortress city in Bavaria, to wait for Russian reinforcements. But Napoleon's army moved faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, French troops surrounded Ulm before the Russians could arrive. On October 20, 1805, Mack surrendered without a major battle. Over 30,000 Austrian soldiers became prisoners of war. Napoleon had defeated half of the Austrian army in a single campaign. It was a masterpiece of strategy, but the war was far from over. The main Austrian and Russian forces were still in the field, and now Napoleon would face his greatest challenge yet. December 2, 1805, the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon's greatest victory. After the disaster at Ulm, Austria and Russia combined their forces. Together they had 85,000 men. Napoleon had only 73,000. The Allies were confident they could defeat Napoleon in open battle. But Napoleon had a plan: the decoy strategy. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable. The Russians and Austrians took the bait, launching a massive attack. But Napoleon had set a trap. As the Allied forces advanced, he sent reinforcements to cut them off. Then he launched his main attack at the center of the enemy line. The French smashed through, dividing the Austrian and Russian armies. the Allies collapsed, forced into a chaotic retreat. Thousands of Russian soldiers drowned in the frozen lakes near the battlefield. By nightfall, Napoleon had won one of the most decisive victories in history. The aftermath of Austerlitz. The results were staggering. The Allies lost 36,000 men, nearly half their army. Napoleon lost less than 9,000. Austria surrendered, signing a humiliating peace treaty. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 1,000 years, was officially dissolved. Napoleon reorganized Germany into the Confederation of the Rhine, turning it into a French puppet state. Europe had never seen a battle like this, and Napoleon was now the undisputed master of the continent. But his greatest enemy, Britain, was still undefeated, and soon his naval power would be put to the test. October 21, 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon's worst defeat. While Napoleon was winning on land, his navy faced disaster at sea. The French and Spanish fleets had finally gathered together. Their goal: break the British naval blockade and gain control of the seas. If successful, Napoleon could once again plan to invade Britain. But they were about to face Britain's greatest naval commander, Admiral Horatio Nelson. The Battle of Trafalgar. On October 21, 1805, the British fleet intercepted the French and Spanish navies off the coast of Spain. Nelson had 27 ships, the French and Spanish had 33 ships, a clear advantage. But Nelson's tactics changed everything. Instead of fighting in a traditional line, he broke his fleet into two attack columns. The British ships smashed through the enemy lines, cutting the French and Spanish fleets into smaller groups. The British gunners were faster and more accurate, destroying enemy ships one by one. By the end of the battle, the French and Spanish lost 22 ships, Britain lost none. The French fleet was shattered. They would never again threaten Britain. But Admiral Nelson was killed, shot by a French sniper in the final hours of the battle. The impact of Trafalgar. Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain were over. The British ruled the seas for the rest of the war. Napoleon would have to defeat Britain another way, through economic warfare. This would lead to the continental system, an economic blockade against Britain. But Trafalgar proved one thing: Napoleon could never defeat Britain at sea. His empire was at its peak, but his greatest challenges were still ahead. He had forced Austria to surrender, and redrawn the map of Europe. His Grande Armée was the strongest land force in the world. But there was one problem: Britain was still undefeated. Napoleon had lost control of the seas at Trafalgar. Britain's navy prevented any French invasion of England. As long as Britain remained in the war, it could fund coalitions against France. So Napoleon devised a new strategy. Instead of defeating Britain militarily, he would strangle its economy. This led to one of his greatest mistakes: the continental system. And while Napoleon expanded his empire further, his obsession with destroying Britain would lead to new enemies, new wars, and his eventual downfall. The continental system. Napoleon's economic war against Britain. What was the continental system? Napoleon's plan was simple: if Britain couldn't trade, its economy would collapse. He issued the Berlin Decrees, 1806, and Milan Decrees. These banned all European nations from trading with Britain. Any ship that traded with Britain would be seized by French forces. Napoleon called this the Continental System. France and its allies would boycott British goods. British ships would be banned from European ports. The goal: to force Britain to surrender without a battle. At first, the plan seemed to work. British trade dropped in Europe. Some British merchants went bankrupt. Napoleon's empire controlled nearly all of mainland Europe. But there were problems. Britain found new markets in South America, India, and the United States. France's own economy suffered because it relied on British goods. Many European nations resisted, especially Spain, Portugal, and Russia. The continental system was supposed to weaken Britain. Instead, it weakened Napoleon's own empire, and led to new wars. The war with Prussia, 1806, the Battle of Jena, Austerlitz. While Napoleon was fighting Austria and Russia, Prussia had remained neutral. But after Austerlitz, Prussia realized Napoleon was becoming too powerful. In October 1806, Prussia declared war on France. Napoleon responded instantly. He moved fast, marching his Grande Armée into Prussian territory. On October 14, he fought the Battle of Jena. Austerlitz. The French annihilated the Prussian army, losing only 5. The Prussians lost over 45,000 men. Their army collapsed in a single day. 2 weeks later, Napoleon marched into Berlin, the heart of Prussia. The once proud Prussian kingdom had been humiliated. Napoleon now controlled Germany. But Prussia had an ally, Russia. And soon, Napoleon would face his next great battle. The war with Russia, 1806-1807. The Battle of Alais. With Prussia defeated, Napoleon turned east to fight Russia. The Russian army, led by General Bennigsen, was still a major threat. Napoleon wanted to destroy the Russian army before it could regroup. In February 1807, Napoleon met the Russians at Alais. The Battle of Alais, February 7–8, 1807. Alais was not a typical Napoleonic victory. The battle was fought in the dead of winter, in snow and freezing conditions. The French and Russian armies clashed for 2 days in a brutal fight. Napoleon launched massive cavalry charges, but the Russians held their ground. By the end of the battle, over 50,000 men lay dead on the frozen battlefield. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic War. Unlike Austerlitz, Alais was not a clear victory. Napoleon had failed to destroy the Russian army. He had won the battle, but at a terrible cost. The war with Russia was not over. Napoleon needed a decisive victory to force Tsar Alexander I to surrender. That victory would come at Friedland. The Battle of Friedland, June 1407, crushing the Russian army. 4 months after Alais, Napoleon finally caught the Russian army at Friedland. This time he did not make the same mistakes. The Russians were trapped against the Ala River. Napoleon ordered a massive attack on their center. The French artillery pounded the Russians, causing chaos and destruction. By nightfall, the Russian army was in full retreat. The results were devastating. Russia lost 40% of its army, over 40,000 men. Napoleon had finally forced Tsar Alexander to negotiate. The Treaty of Tilsit, July 1807, Napoleon and the Tsar. After Friedland, Tsar Alexander I had no choice but to make peace. The meeting at Tilsit, Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. They agreed to divide Europe between them. Russia recognized Napoleon's empire and joined the continental system. For Napoleon, this was a huge success. France and Russia were now allies. Britain was completely isolated. Napoleon was at the peak of his power. But Tilsit had one major problem. Russia was not truly loyal to Napoleon. And when Russia later broke the agreement, it would lead to Napoleon's most disastrous campaign, his invasion of Russia. The Spanish Ulcer, the beginning of the Peninsular War. At the same time, Napoleon's empire was expanding. He placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Naples. He created the Duchy of Warsaw out of Polish lands. He began increasing his control over Spain and Portugal, but in doing so, he made a terrible mistake. The invasion of Spain, 1808, Napoleon removed Spain's Bourbon king and replaced him with his brother Joseph. The Spanish people rebelled, refusing to accept French rule. Britain sent troops to help Spain, led by Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington. A new war had begun. The Peninsular War. Spain would become a nightmare for Napoleon. French forces faced constant guerrilla attacks. The British army defeated the French in key battles. Napoleon had to send more and more troops to control Spain. It would become his Spanish ulcer, a constant drain on his army and resources. And soon, Napoleon's empire would begin to unravel. The beginning of Napoleon's downfall. By 1808, Napoleon's empire seemed unstoppable. He had defeated every major European power. His continental system was in place to strangle Britain's economy. France ruled most of Europe, from Portugal to Poland. But Napoleon made 2 major mistakes. He invaded Spain, underestimating the power of nationalist resistance. He forced Russia into the continental system, ignoring its economic needs. Both mistakes would eventually destroy his empire. The Spanish ulcer. The Peninsular War begins. Why did Napoleon invade Spain? In 1807, Napoleon's continental system was falling apart. Britain was still trading with Portugal. Napoleon ordered French troops into Portugal to stop British influence. Spain helped France invade Portugal, but soon, Napoleon turned on Spain itself. Napoleon saw Spain as weak, Spain's King Charles IV was unpopular and corrupt. His son Napoleon's occupation of Spain triggered a massive revolt. His son, Ferdinand, was plotting to overthrow him. Napoleon removed both kings and put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. But Napoleon underestimated the Spanish people. They refused to accept a French king. Across Spain, guerrilla fighters rose up against the French army. Britain sent troops to help Spain, led by Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon had walked into a disaster. Spain became his Spanish ulcer, a war that bled France for years. The 2 de Mayo uprising, Napoleon's occupation of Spain, triggered a massive revolt. The people of Madrid rose up against French troops. Spanish civilians armed themselves, attacking the French with knives, farm tools, and anything available. The French responded with brutal force, massacring civilians in Madrid. The Spanish did not surrender. Instead, the revolt spread across the country. The rise of guerrilla warfare. Napoleon's forces expected a traditional war. Instead, they faced a nightmare. Spanish fighters called guerrillas launched hit-and-run attacks. French supply lines were cut. French troops could not move safely outside major cities. This was a new kind of war, and Napoleon had no answer for it. Britain enters the war. The Battle of Vimaro, August 1808. Spain was not fighting alone. Britain sent an army to Portugal, led by Arthur Wellesley. At the Battle of Vimaro, August 21, 1808, British troops defeated the French. Napoleon's forces were forced out of Portugal. Britain had gained a foothold in Europe. Napoleon realized the situation was out of control. He personally led an army into Spain to restore order. Napoleon's Spanish campaign. Napoleon marched into Spain with He won major battles, including the Battle of Somosierra, November 1808. He captured Madrid and restored French control. But Napoleon made a critical mistake. He left Spain too soon. Napoleon returned to France in 1809 to deal with Austria. He left weaker generals to fight the Spanish and British. This decision doomed his Spanish campaign. The British defeated the French at Talavera, 1809. Guerrilla warfare kept the French from fully controlling Spain. Spain was never pacified. It drained Napoleon's resources for years. The Austrian War of 1809, Napoleon's last great victory. While Napoleon was struggling in Spain, Austria declared war again. Austria saw France as vulnerable, and launched an attack in April 1809. Napoleon rushed back from Spain to face them. The Battle of Aspern-Essling, May 1809, Napoleon's first major defeat. For the first time, Napoleon was defeated in a major battle. The French attempted to cross the Danube River, but were trapped by Austrian forces. Napoleon was forced to retreat. It was his first battlefield loss. But Napoleon struck back. The Battle of Wagram, July 1809, crushing Austria again. 2 months later, Napoleon launched a massive counterattack. At Wagram, he defeated Austria once again. Austria was forced to surrender and make peace. Napoleon had won, but the war drained French resources. His enemies learned from Wagram. They knew Napoleon could be beaten. His military dominance was starting to crack. The decline of the continental system. By 1810, Napoleon controlled most of Europe. Spain and Portugal were still resisting. Britain was still undefeated. Russia was growing restless under the continental system. The continental system was failing. Britain traded with South America, Asia, and the US. French merchants suffered under Napoleon's trade blockade. Many countries, including Russia, secretly ignored Napoleon's trade law. Napoleon was furious at Russia. Tsar Alexander I secretly resumed trade with Britain. Napoleon threatened war if Russia did not fully commit. In 1812, Napoleon made his greatest mistake. He assembled the largest army in history. He prepared to invade Russia and force it back into his empire. It would become his most disastrous campaign, the fatal gamble. By 1812, Napoleon was at the height of his power. France ruled most of Europe. His grand army was the largest in history, but his empire was starting to crack. Russia was defying the continental system. Tsar Alexander I had resumed trade with Britain. Napoleon saw this as an act of war. He decided to invade Russia and crush the Tsar's resistance. It would become his greatest mistake.
one that would destroy his army, his empire and his legacy. Napoleon prepares for war. The Grand Army, Napoleon's largest force ever assembled. Napoleon prepared an army larger than any in history, over 600,000 soldiers from across Europe, troops from France, Italy, Poland, Germany and even Spain, more than 200,000 horses, and 1,000 cannon. Napoleon was confident. He expected a quick victory. He planned to defeat the Russian army in one massive battle. He thought the war would be over in just a few months, but Russia had a different plan. The Russian strategy, avoiding battle. The Russian generals knew they could not defeat Napoleon in open battle. Instead, they planned to lure him deep into Russia. They would retreat instead of fighting. They would destroy their own villages, farms and supplies to starve the French. Napoleon's army would be weakened by exhaustion, hunger and disease. It was a deadly trap, and Napoleon walked straight into it. Crossing the Neman, the invasion begins, June 24, 1812. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon led his army across the Neman River, the border between Poland and Russia. It was the beginning of the most disastrous campaign of his career. His first mistake was underestimating the size of Russia. His second mistake was thinking the Russians would fight him immediately. For weeks, Napoleon marched into Russia without a battle. The Russians retreated, burning their own cities and supplies. The French army began to suffer. Heat, disease and exhaustion killed thousands. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, his army had already lost 150,000 men, and he had not fought a single major battle. The Battle of Smolensk. Finally, the Russians stopped retreating and defended the city of Smolensk. French cannons bombarded the city for days. Russian troops fought fiercely but eventually abandoned the city. Napoleon captured Smolensk, but it was a hollow victory. The city was burned to the ground. The Russians had destroyed their own supplies before retreating. Napoleon had nothing to feed his army. He was now deep inside Russia with winter approaching. But instead of turning back, he pushed forward toward Moscow. It was a fatal decision. The road to Moscow. The Russian army prepares for battle. For months, Napoleon had chased the Russian army, but they refused to fight. But at Borodino, 70 miles from Moscow, the Russians finally made their stand. They knew Napoleon could not be allowed to take Moscow without a fight. The largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars was about to begin. On September 7, 1812, the two greatest armies in Europe clashed in a battle of unimaginable slaughter. The Battle of Borodino, September 7, 1812, the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had the Russians had 120,000 men. For 12 hours the two sides fought in brutal combat. The French launched attack after attack, but the Russians refused to break. The battlefield was covered in smoke, blood and the bodies of the dead. By nightfall over 75,000 men lay dead or wounded. Napoleon won the battle, but at a terrible cost. His army was exhausted. The Russians retreated, but they were not defeated. Napoleon's army was too weak to finish the war. Still, he marched on to Moscow, expecting the Tsar to surrender. The Fire of Moscow, September 14, 1812. On September 14, Napoleon's army entered Moscow, but the city was completely empty. The Russians had abandoned it. Napoleon expected Tsar Alexander to surrender. Instead, that night, fires broke out across Moscow. Russian arsonists set the city on fire. Napoleon's men watched as the flames engulfed the entire city. Within days, Moscow was destroyed. Napoleon had taken the Russian capital, but it meant nothing. Napoleon waited in Moscow for a Russian surrender that never came. After 5 weeks with winter approaching, Napoleon realized his mistake. He had nothing to feed his army. The Russians refused to negotiate. He had no choice but to retreat. The retreat from Moscow, October-December 1812. Napoleon's worst nightmare. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon ordered his army to leave Moscow, but the retreat quickly turned into a disaster. Winter arrived early, with blizzards, freezing temperatures and starvation. Russian Cossack cavalry attacked the retreating French columns. Napoleon's mighty army collapsed. Thousands froze to death in the snow. Soldiers ate their own dead to survive. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, leaving cannons and wagons abandoned in the. By the time Napoleon reached the Berezina River in November, his army was in ruins. The disaster at the Berezina River. Napoleon's last chance was to cross the Berezina River before the Russian army caught him. His engineers built makeshift bridges over the icy water, but as the French tried to cross, the Russians attacked. The scene was one of horror. Thousands were trampled into the freezing river. The ice turned red with blood. Tens of thousands died trying to escape. Napoleon barely escaped with his life. By the time the retreat ended, only 30,000 French soldiers remained, out of the 600,000 that had begun the campaign. The emperor's empire crumbles. Napoleon's disastrous retreat from Russia had shattered his once mighty army. In 1812 he had marched into Russia with over 600. By the time he returned to France, only 30,000 remained. His empire, once unshakable, was now on the verge of collapse. But Napoleon would not surrender easily. In 1813 he raised a new army and fought to hold his empire together. The greatest battle of the Napoleonic Wars was about to take place. The world was turning against him, and his enemies were closing in. This is the story of Napoleon's final struggle for survival. Europe unites against Napoleon. 1813. After Napoleon's defeat in Russia, his enemies saw their chance to destroy him for good. A new coalition was formed, one greater than ever before. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden and Spain all joined forces, their goal to defeat Napoleon and end his reign forever. In total, over 1 million troops were raised to fight against France. Napoleon had never faced such overwhelming odds, but he refused to back down. He rushed back to France and began rebuilding his army. He called up young conscripts, veterans and even old soldiers. Within months he had gathered a new army of. It was not the same grand army that had once conquered Europe, but it was all he had. The German campaign of 1813, Napoleon's last gamble. Napoleon marched east into Germany, hoping to defeat his enemies before they could fully unite. His first major victory came at Lutzen, May. A few weeks later he won another battle at Botzen. For a brief moment it seemed Napoleon was still unbeatable, but his enemies were learning. They avoided fighting one-on-one battles. They outmaneuvered Napoleon's army. They used their overwhelming numbers to slowly grind him down. By the fall of 1813, Napoleon faced the greatest battle of his life, the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. The largest battle in European history was about to begin. The battle raged for 4 days with over 600,000 men fighting. At first Napoleon fought with his usual brilliance. He repelled enemy attacks and held his ground. But as the battle dragged on, his army began to collapse. On October 18, a critical mistake sealed Napoleon's fate. The Saxons, one of Napoleon's allies, suddenly switched sides. They turned their cannons against the French. Napoleon's army fell into chaos. By October 19, Napoleon was forced to retreat, but it was too late. The French army was in full retreat. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. Napoleon had suffered his worst defeat ever. It was now clear his empire was collapsing. The invasion of France, 1814, the Allies close in after the disaster at Leipzig. Napoleon retreated to France. His army was exhausted, outnumbered and broken, but his enemies were relentless. They launched a full-scale invasion of France. By early 1814, the Allies crossed into France from all sides. The Russians advanced from the east. The Austrians marched from the south. The British, led by the Duke of Wellington, attacked from Spain. Napoleon was now fighting for his survival. The last campaign, Napoleon's final victories. Even with his empire crumbling, Napoleon refused to surrender. He gathered what troops he could, many of them young boys and old men. He launched a desperate campaign to defend France. In a series of brilliant victories he defeated the Allies at Brienne-la-Rothière and Montmirail. For a moment it seemed like he might turn the war around, but the sheer numbers of the enemy were too much. Paris was now the target, and Napoleon could not stop them. By March 1814, the Allies marched on the French capital. On March 31, 1814, Paris fell to the Allies. Napoleon had lost everything. Napoleon's abdication, April 6, 1814. The emperor falls with Paris lost. Napoleon retreated to Fontainebleau. He still wanted to fight, but his generals refused. They knew the war was lost. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The Allies exiled him to the island of Elba, a tiny Mediterranean island. They allowed him to keep his title of emperor, but he was now ruler of nothing. Napoleon's once great empire had been shattered. It seemed like the Napoleonic Wars were finally over, but Napoleon was not finished yet. The 100 Days 1815, Napoleon's last stand in exile on Elba. Napoleon watched as France fell into chaos. The new French king Louis XVIII was unpopular. Many in the army still loyal to Napoleon. The people wanted their emperor back. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba. He sailed back to France with just 1,000 soldiers. He marched toward Paris, gathering thousands of troops along the way. When he reached the French army, he stepped forward and opened his coat. "Soldiers, if you wish to kill your emperor, here I am." Instead of shooting, the soldiers cheered, "Vive l'empereur!" Napoleon had returned. Europe declares war on Napoleon. The Allies were shocked. Napoleon had returned to power in just 20 days. He promised peace, but the Allies refused to negotiate. They declared him an enemy of Europe. Napoleon had only one choice: fight. He raised a new army and marched to Belgium. Waiting for him was the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians. The stage was set for the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's final stand. The stage was set for one of the most famous battles in history, the Battle of Waterloo. The road to Waterloo. Napoleon's strategy was simple. He would attack before the Allies could unite. If he defeated the British first, he could then turn against the Prussians. He divided his army, sending General Ney to face the British and Marshal Grouchy to chase the Prussians. On June 16, 1815, Napoleon won his last victory at the Battle of Ligny, defeating the Prussians under Blücher. But there was a problem. The Prussians were not completely destroyed. Instead of retreating east as Napoleon expected, they moved north toward Wellington. Meanwhile, Ney failed to stop Wellington at the Battle of Quatre Bras. Now the British and Prussians were regrouping. Napoleon had one last chance to defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon marched to Waterloo.
The battlefield. Wellington had chosen his ground well. His army of 68,000 men held a ridge near the village of Mont Saint-Jean. His troops were a mix of British, Dutch, and Belgian forces. He placed them behind the ridge, using the high ground for defense. Napoleon had 72,000 men, but his army was not as strong as before. Many of his best veterans had died in previous wars. Some of his troops were inexperienced conscripts. He was also sick, suffering from stomach pains that slowed his decisions. The night before, heavy rain turned the battlefield into mud. This delayed Napoleon's attack, giving the Prussians more time to arrive. The battle begins. At 11:30 a.m., Napoleon ordered his first attack. His target, Hougoumont, a large farmhouse defended by British troops. He hoped to draw in Wellington's reserves, but the British held firm, and Hougoumont never fell. Napoleon launched his main attack. 18,000 French soldiers marched forward in tight formations. Wellington's men waited behind the ridge. When the French got close, the British rose and fired a deadly volley of musket fire. The French charged up the hill but were pushed back. Napoleon was getting frustrated. He needed to break Wellington's line, and fast. Ney's cavalry charge. Marshal Ney thought Wellington was retreating. He ordered a massive cavalry charge, without waiting for infantry support. 9,000 French cavalrymen stormed up the hill, but Wellington's infantry formed defensive squares. The French charged again and again, but could not break through. By 6 p.m., French casualties were mounting. And then Napoleon saw movement on the horizon. It was the Prussians. The Prussians arrive. Blücher's Prussian army had marched 12 hours non-stop to reach Waterloo. They hit Napoleon's right flank, forcing him to divert troops. Napoleon knew that time was running out. He had one last chance. At 7:30 p.m., he sent in the Imperial Guard, his elite troops undefeated in battle. They marched up the ridge, pushing back Wellington's men. But Wellington ordered a counterattack. The British fired volley after volley, and for the first time ever the Imperial Guard broke. Seeing the Imperial Guard retreat, the French army collapsed. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. By 8:30 p.m., Napoleon's army was in full retreat. The aftermath. The Battle of Waterloo was over. Napoleon had lost 25,000 men. The British and Prussians had lost over 22,000. Wellington, exhausted, called it a close-run thing. Napoleon fled back to Paris. The French turned against him. He abdicated for the second time on June 20. This time the Allies would not let him escape. On July 15, 1815, Napoleon surrendered to the British. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. He never returned to power again. The Napoleonic Wars were over. Europe entered a new era of peace, but Napoleon's legend would live on forever. The end of an era. The Battle of Waterloo was not just the fall of Napoleon. It was the end of a period that had shaped Europe for over 20 years. But Napoleon remains one of the most fascinating figures in history. His rise was meteoric. His military genius changed warfare forever. His legacy still influences the modern world. Though he spent his final years in exile, Napoleon never faded from history. And to this day, his name is remembered as one of the greatest military commanders of all time.